Welcome to the Souls of the Horizon and J-Cat Adventures. Immerse yourself in thrilling escapades, luxurious settings, and captivating storytelling fantasies through ebooks and print editions. Crafted for suspense, adventure, and timeless drama. Join a global community of fans as we dive into great storytelling. Subscribe now and awaken your spirit for excitement, and don't forget to click the link to donate and help me continue creating the stories you love.
Shadows and Redemption: The Soul of Beebop, short story. Beebop had lived more years on the streets than he cared to count. Born in the crumbling projects on the west side of town, he had learned early that life was a brutal, unforgiving fight. His father had been a ghost, a name on a birth certificate and nothing more, and his mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, leaving Beebop to raise himself. By the time he was 13, he was running errands for the local gangs, slipping into the shadows with stolen goods or collecting debts for a few crumpled bills. Each scar on his knuckles was a story, a memory of a life where every step forward came at a cost. He had once dreamed of leaving it all behind, maybe even starting over somewhere far away, but those dreams had died the day his sister, Mia, was buried. Now, the streets were all he had, and they had shaped him into a man who knew how to survive, at any cost. A wiry man in his late 50s, his knuckles were scarred from countless fights, and his face was a canvas of hard lines that told stories of battles fought and lost, both on the streets and in his soul. He wasn't a good man, not by anyone's standards, least of all his own. But even a thug like Beebop had his code, and that code would soon be tested. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon. Beebop was shuffling down 8th Street, his leather jacket loose around his shoulders, his breath misting in the chilly air. He'd just left Benny's pawn shop, a place where he often traded knickknacks for cash, and he was feeling the familiar itch for a drink. Then he saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, standing by a lamppost with a lost look in her eyes. Her long, dark hair fell in unkempt waves over a thin hoodie that was far too light for the weather. She wasn't begging, but her hollow cheeks and trembling hands spoke volumes. The street light above flickered erratically, casting shadows on the cracked pavement littered with cigarette butts and discarded wrappers. Behind her, a boarded-up convenience store loomed, its windows covered in graffiti tags and faded posters advertising long-forgotten events. The cold wind whipped through the alley, carrying with it the sour stench of garbage from an overflowing dumpster nearby. Lila's thin frame looked impossibly small against the grim backdrop, her fragile figure trembling as though the very weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. Beebop stopped in his tracks, something about her hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Kid, you alright?" he rasped, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes and shouting over street brawls. The girl flinched, her wide, doe-like eyes darting to him. For a moment, she looked like she might run, but instead, she nodded quickly and mumbled, "I'm fine." She wasn't fine. Beebop knew that look. He'd seen it before, on his sister, Mia, the day she'd come home bruised and shaken, hiding the truth of her troubles from everyone. Mia had been 17 when she died, her bright future stolen by a boyfriend who'd gotten her hooked on smack and left her to die in a filthy alley. Beebop had never forgiven himself for not protecting her, for not seeing the signs until it was too late. Looking at this girl, he felt that same old guilt clawing at him. In his mind, he was back on that sweltering summer afternoon years ago when he'd last seen Mia alive. She had come home late, her mascara smudged and her voice shaky, brushing off his questions with an unconvincing smile. He'd noticed the bruises on her arm but hadn't pressed her, too caught up in his own struggles to see how far she had fallen. The last thing she'd said to him was, "Don't worry, Beebs. I can handle it." 2 weeks later, she was gone. The memory of identifying her lifeless body in the morgue had haunted him ever since, a constant reminder of his failure. Now, staring at Lila, he saw the same vulnerability, the same silent cry for help he'd ignored in Mia. This time, he swore to himself, he wouldn't make the same mistake. He didn't even know her name, but he felt an almost primal need to do something, anything, to help her. "You got a name?" he asked. "Lila," she whispered. "You got someone looking out for you, Lila?" he pressed. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Before he could ask more, a rusty sedan screeched to a stop at the curb. A man leaned out of the driver's side window, his face pale and sweaty. "Lila, get in the car," he barked. The girl froze, terror flashing across her face. Beebop stepped between her and the car without thinking, his broad frame blocking the man's view. "She ain't going nowhere with you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes narrowed. "Mind your own business, old man." Beebop didn't move. He stared the man down until he cursed under his breath and sped off, the tires screeching as the car disappeared down the street. When Beebop turned back to Lila, she was shaking like a leaf. "You know that guy?" he asked. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He works for Kane." Beebop's stomach turned. Kane was a name he knew all too well. A ruthless dealer who ran a trap house over on the east side, Kane was known for keeping his girls strung out and dependent on him. Beebop had avoided crossing paths with him for years, knowing the man was bad news even by the street's low standards. But now it was personal. "You're not going back there," he said firmly. "Not if I've got anything to say about it." That night, Beebop prepared for war. He started by sitting down in his cramped apartment, the flickering light bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across the room. On the table before him was a battered duffel bag, and he began to fill it with the tools of his trade: duct tape, an old combat knife he kept from a long-ago scrap, a pair of gloves, and a bottle of whiskey he took a swig from before setting it aside. His hands moved with purpose, his face a mask of grim determination. The faint smell of motor oil still clung to the crowbar Roy had given him, and he tested its weight with a few practice swings. Beebop knew this wasn't going to be a clean job. Kane's operation was infamous, and his enforcers were known for their cruelty. But that didn't matter. Beebop wasn't going in to negotiate or bargain, he was going in to end things. As he laced up his steel-toed boots, his mind wandered briefly to Mia, her laughter, the way she'd always called him her big protector. He'd failed her once, but this time, he would not falter. This time, he would burn the world down if it meant giving Lila a chance to escape its clutches. He grabbed a faded photograph from the bookshelf, Mia's high school portrait, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. It wasn't for luck, it was a reminder of what was at stake. Finally, he shrugged on his leather jacket, zipped it up, and slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. He took one last look around the apartment, his sanctuary and his prison, before stepping out into the cold night air. There was no turning back now. He didn't ask Lila for details. He didn't need to. He'd heard enough stories about Kane's operation to know what kind of hell the girl had been through. And he knew there was only one way to deal with a man like Kane, head on, with no mercy. His first stop was an old mechanic shop on 12th Street, where his friend Roy worked late shifts. Roy was one of the few people Beebop trusted, a grizzled ex-Marine who owed him a favor or two. When Beebop walked in, Roy took one look at his face and knew something was up. "What's the job?" Roy asked, wiping grease off his hands. "I need hardware." "Nothing fancy, just something that'll do the job," Beebop said. Roy nodded and disappeared into the back. He returned with a crowbar and an old revolver. "The crowbar's for when you're up close. The revolver's for when you're not." "Appreciated," Beebop said, slipping the weapons into his jacket. From there, he headed to Kane's turf. The trap house was a dilapidated two-story building on the edge of town, its windows boarded up and its front yard littered with trash. Beebop parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, his footsteps silent despite his heavy boots. The front door was guarded by two men, both big and mean-looking. Beebop didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked up to them like he owned the place, and when one of them stepped forward to stop him, Beebop swung the crowbar in a wide arc. It connected with a sickening crack, dropping the man to the ground. The second guard barely had time to react before Beebop drove his fist into his gut, then brought the crowbar down on his head. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sweat and cheap drugs. The living room was filled with junkies sprawled on stained couches, their glazed eyes barely registering Beebop as he stormed through. He found Kane in the back room, surrounded by a couple of his goons and counting a wad of cash. The dealer looked up in surprise as Beebop kicked the door open. "You lost, old man?" Kane sneered. "Not at all," Beebop said, pulling the revolver from his jacket. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling, and the goons scattered like roaches. Kane's smirk faltered as Beebop advanced on him, the crowbar in one hand and the revolver in the other. "Where's the girl?" Beebop growled. "What girl?" Kane said, trying to play dumb. Beebop didn't have time for games. He grabbed Kane by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "The girl you've been keeping drugged up and locked away. Where is she?" Kane's eyes darted to a door at the far end of the room. Beebop didn't wait for an invitation. He threw Kane to the ground and kicked the door open, revealing a small, windowless room. Lila was there, curled up on a filthy mattress, her wrists bound and her eyes glassy from whatever they'd been pumping into her. "Lila," Beebop said softly, dropping the crowbar and rushing to her side. He untied her wrists and gently shook her. "Come on, kid. We're getting out of here." She blinked up at him, her lips trembling. "Beebop?" "Yeah, it's me. You're safe now." He carried her out of the house, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and relief. By the time the cops showed up, called by a neighbor who'd heard the gunshot, Beebop was long gone, with Lila safe in the passenger seat of his beat-up truck. As he drove her to the nearest hospital, Beebop felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But it was a fragile, tentative kind of hope, one laced with guilt and uncertainty. The rhythmic hum of the truck's engine filled the silence, and Beebop glanced at Lila, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her frail body seemed even smaller now, her face pale and streaked with tears. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles widening as memories of Mia flooded back. He remembered the nights he and Mia would sit on the roof of their building, sharing a stale pack of crackers while looking at the stars. She'd talk about her dreams, becoming an artist, traveling the world, finding a life far away from the streets. Back then, Beebop had believed her dreams could come true, even as his own crumbled under the weight of reality. But when she fell, he fell with her, sinking into a darkness he'd never truly escaped. Now, looking at Lila, he wondered if this was his chance for redemption. The hospital's neon sign came into view, and Beebop exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. As he pulled into the emergency entrance, he turned to Lila, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're here, kid," he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy but filled with something he hadn't seen before: trust. For the first time in years, Beebop felt like he was doing something right. He carried her through the sliding doors, his rough exterior contrasting sharply with the sterile, bright interior of the hospital. Nurses rushed to take Lila from his arms, their voices a blur as they asked questions he couldn't answer. Standing there, alone in the waiting room, Beebop felt a knot in his chest loosen. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring Mia back or erase the years of violence and regret. But tonight, he'd saved a life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start making peace with himself. He couldn't save Mia, but maybe, just maybe, he could save Lila. And for a man like Beebop, that was enough to keep him going. Beebop never planned on becoming a protector, let alone a big brother. After years spent scraping by on the streets, surviving fistfights, running petty jobs for local gangsters, and watching his dreams disintegrate under the weight of regret, the idea of being responsible for anyone else felt alien. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and for Beebop, that curveball came in the form of Lila. It all started the morning after Beebop had carried Lila to the hospital. He was leaning against his beat-up truck in the parking lot, sipping bad coffee and wondering what came next. The nurses had assured him she'd pull through. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and coming off a dangerous cocktail of drugs, but she was young and strong enough to recover, physically, at least. But Beebop's gut told him she wasn't out of the woods. Kids like her didn't just bounce back, the streets had a way of pulling you back down no matter how hard you tried to climb out. When he finally stepped back into the hospital, Lila was awake. She looked small and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights, her face pale and her eyes puffy from crying. But when she saw him, something shifted. Her eyes softened, and she offered him the faintest ghost of a smile. It hit Beebop like a punch to the chest. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "How you holding up?" Lila shrugged, fiddling with the scratchy hospital blanket. "Better, I guess. Thanks for, saving me." Beebop waved it off. "Don't mention it. You got anywhere to go? Family? Friends?" She shook her head, her expression darkening. "No. I don't have anyone." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Beebop's first instinct was to walk away. He wasn't a hero, and he definitely wasn't equipped to take care of a teenager. But then he thought of Mia, her laughter, her bruises, her voice pleading for help he hadn't given in time. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. "All right," he said, his tone gruff but resolute. "Then you're coming with me." The first few weeks were rough. Beebop's apartment was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. The furniture was mismatched and threadbare, the walls stained with years of cigarette smoke, and the fridge was perpetually empty. Lila slept on the couch, her small bag of belongings tucked under her head like a pillow. She didn't complain, though. She'd been through worse, and Bebop's gruff kindness was more than she'd had in a long time. Beebop wasn't exactly the nurturing type. He didn't know how to cook anything more complicated than instant noodles, and his idea of a heart-to-heart was a few grunted sentences followed by an awkward silence. But he tried. He stocked the fridge with real food, even if it meant skimping on his own vices. He showed Lila how to lock the doors and keep her head down, teaching her the unspoken rules of survival on the streets. And when she had nightmares, which she often did, he'd sit by her side, a comforting presence in the dark. Lila, for her part, started to come out of her shell. She was still guarded, still haunted by the things she'd been through, but she began to trust Beebop in small, tentative ways. She'd tell him about her favorite books, the ones she used to read before life went sideways. She'd laugh at his dry, self-deprecating humor, her smile lighting up the dingy apartment like a beacon. And slowly but surely, she began to see him not just as a grizzled old thug, but as someone who cared. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Beebop had taken Lila to a diner, one of those greasy joints where the coffee was cheap and the waitresses knew your name. They were sitting in a corner booth, Lila picking at a plate of fries while Beebop nursed a cup of black coffee. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "What's next for you, kid? You thinking about school, a job, something?" Lila looked up, her brow furrowing. "I don't know. I never really thought about it. I mean, school sounds nice, but..." She trailed off, her expression clouding with doubt. "But what?" Beebop pressed. She shrugged. "I don't know if I'm good enough or smart enough. What if I fail?" Beebop leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Listen, Lila. Life's gonna kick you down. That's a given. But you're tougher than you think. You got out of that hellhole, didn't you? You're still standing. That's more than most people can say. So don't sell yourself short, all right?" She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right." As the months went by, they settled into a rhythm. Beebop found odd jobs to keep the bills paid, fixing cars, hauling scrap metal, the kind of work he'd done his whole life. Lila enrolled in night classes, determined to finish high school. She'd come home with stacks of textbooks and notes, spreading them out on the kitchen table while Beebop pretended not to hover. They argued sometimes, of course. Lila had a stubborn streak, and Beebop wasn't exactly the patient type. But beneath the bickering was a bond neither of them could deny. They weren't just roommates, they were family. And for the first time in years, Beebop felt like he had a purpose. Protecting Lila wasn't just about making up for his past mistakes. It was about building something new, something worth fighting for. One night, as they sat on the fire escape sharing a bag of chips, Lila turned to him and said, "You know, you're kind of like a big brother to me." Beebop chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. "Yeah? Well, you're kind of like a little sister to me." They sat in companionable silence, the city lights stretching out before them. For the first time in a long time, Beebop felt at peace. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The streets were still dangerous, and the ghosts of his past still lingered. But as long as Lila was by his side, he knew he'd keep going. Because that's what big brothers did.
And that's a wrap on another thrilling episode. From heart-pounding action to emotional connections, Jay Bahari will never fails to excite. Don't miss the next adventure. Subscribe now for more suspense, romance, fantasy and mystery. Want to dive deeper? Grab an ebook on Etsy or a paperback on Amazon to keep the excitement going. You can also catch the podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or Amazon Music. If you're hooked on the Souls of the Horizon and J-Cat adventures, show your support today. Click the link to donate, and help us continue creating the stories you love. Until next time, stay adventurous, there's no mystery is too big to solve. Disclaimer and notes. The Adventures of the Souls of the Horizon and J-Cat Adventures is a work of fiction. The characters, events, and settings depicted in this series are the products of the author's imagination and are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This series contains mature themes, including but not limited to romantic and erotic content. that may not be suitable for all audiences. Reader discretion is advised. The depictions of relationships, encounters, and situations are intended for entertainment purposes only and do not reflect real-life practices or endorse any specific behaviors. The portrayal of characters, including their actions and interactions, is intended to be a dramatic and fictional narrative. The series is not intended to promote or condone any form of violence, exploitation, or abuse. The characters of the Souls of the Horizon and J-Cat Adventures, while depicted as a hero in fictional scenarios, is a creation meant to entertain and should not be considered a role model for real-life behavior. Readers are reminded that this is a work of fiction and should enjoy it as such. Any interpretations or applications of the content within real-world contexts are the responsibility of the reader. The author and publishers disclaim any liability for actions taken by readers based on fictional portrayals and scenarios in the series. Notes: J. Bahari, the imaginative mind behind the Souls of the Horizon and the Adventures of J-Cat, has a unique talent for weaving tales of mystery, romance, fantasy and adventure. With a flair for creating captivating characters and intricate plots. J. Bahari's storytelling is enriched by a deep understanding of human nature and a keen eye for detail, crafting narratives that resonate with both excitement and emotional depth. Each episode of The Souls of the Horizon and J-Cat's Adventures is a testament to Bahari's ability to blend intrigue with passion, creating a world where the extraordinary becomes reality. In this creative journey, J. Bahari has harnessed the power of artificial intelligence to enhance the storytelling process. With the help of AI input, Bahari has been able to explore new dimensions of creativity, pushing the boundaries of conventional storytelling to deliver an experience that is both innovative and compelling. Together, J. Bahari and AI have crafted a series that not only entertains but also captivates the imagination, inviting readers into a world where seduction and suspense intertwine in the most alluring ways. This collaboration stands as a testament to the endless possibilities that arise when human creativity meets cutting-edge technology, forging a path to stories that are as mesmerizing as they are unforgettable.
Sold in a digital age, J. Bahari's love breaking out of range. Soul ambition breaking down the wall. 60 years deep, but